Right, so today I've got Peter-William Nel from GES Labs down in Cape Town online with me for the discussion. And Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me.
Cool, excellent. Let me give everyone a bit of background on Peter. Peter obviously runs an operation, a facility down in Cape Town that's focused on, manufacturing ingredients, specifically on indigenous botanicals. And he's going to tell you a bit more about GES Labs and their operations. The one disclaimer I did want to make is that obviously we're going to be focused more generally on botanical extractions as a whole, because that's what he's doing. But a lot of that is busy evolving, and we expect improvements from SAPRA on the processing side. So he may very soon in the future be facilitating extractions around extraction, depending on how the legislative framework works out. So Peter, GES Labs, I've put some images of the facility that you've kindly shared with us on screen. Tell us a bit more about, why did you get into starting a botanical extraction-based company, and what are the services you guys are currently offering?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff, for that. So GS Labs, we're a little business, kind of GMP compliant, specialized botanical extraction business in Cape Town. We're actually in Capricorn Business Park. And basically, so I'm a process engineer, and a big passion of mine has always been solvent extraction, the refinement of active ingredients, and more importantly, medicines. And, coming from South Africa, South Africa has got a wealth of indigenous botanicals that are globally recognized. A few of these, and the most kind of famous one that even popped up during COVID times is Pelargonium pseudoides. So, everyone knows Lintagon. Everyone knows really what Lintagon does for you. And, especially in times like COVID, we really saw how important it is to really recognize these natural resources that South Africa has. So GS Labs wants to protect the integrity of that natural resource in our country. And that's the birth of GS, was really looking at these indigenous botanicals, manufacturing globally recognized GMP approved medicines for them, and kind of supporting South Africa's economy through that. So putting Africa, or more particularly South Africa, on the map for these botanical applications and medicines that are widely used in the world.
Perfect, 100%. Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, often Western medicine tends to focus on like an isolate type product, something that's a single molecule for clinical trial evaluations. And increasingly, there's been this push back into botanicals, which makes, this is where we started out as a species, engaging with the plants, using plants as medicine. Increasingly, I expect this is the future, whether we're talking about the use of psychedelics, the use of cannabis, just using natural botanicals. It's going to be the next decade, 2 decades of pharmacology, I feel, outside of perhaps novel synthesis, but that's been around. I want to kind of go into your experience. I know that this is obviously focused on, let's call it less controversial botanicals in the space, but you've been involved with, cannabis and hemp going back to 2015 with Tony Budden. Can you maybe talk us through some of the activities that you engaged with in Malawi starting out, a good 6 years ago?
Yeah, so basically my relationship with the plant started when I was actually at university, studying to become a chemical engineer. And, when Tony was doing all of his wonderful work on hemp and the uses of it, as a keen scientist and really intuitive scientist as well, I had to really understand, the science behind this. And more particularly, I have a huge passion for environmental sustainability. So, for me, there was all this media and all this hype around cellulose as a plastic. And everyone has seen, the photo of hemp plastic, degrading after 12 days, 24 days, 48 days. And basically, I was caught, and I wanted to do a thesis on it. So I really wanted to go and look at, okay, how do we take cellulose, which is an ingredient from the plant or the stalk, how do we extract that? How do we isolate that? And how do we actually use it as a reinforcement to biocomposites? Now, biocomposites could be basic materials from packaging all the way through to even biocompatible materials that can be used in, surgeries. And basically during that, I developed my relationship with Tony. I got to know the plant very, very well, and I got to know the hemp plant extremely well. And that kind of really developed my knowledge around the extraction of cellulose. And that was before, this whole medical cannabis global kind of, let's say, opening the doors happened, before CBD was even a word or vocabulary in most people's mouths. And we were specifically looking at this. And Tony had partnered with Tanya Clark, who is an awesome philanthropist and entrepreneur in Malawi. And she was also inspired by Tony's work since '94 with Hemporium. And Tony had seen some of the work that I had been doing. He had seen some of the scientific approaches that I'd been using, and some of the kind of African technologies that I've been wanting to develop. And, back then, Invigrow was still in its infancy. So, he kind of said, look, Tanya, I think Peter should go up to Malawi, and we should really look at how we can start this kind of cellulose, hemp, textile, as well as looking at very basically CBD extraction as well. So that's where my journey started. I finished my degree, and firstly, my thesis was around the application of cellulose as a reinforcement for biomaterials. And I went and I took that knowledge to Malawi. And while there, something very interesting happened. Canada legalized recreational cannabis. America was starting to open its doors on recreational, and there was this massive kind of boom around CBD, and everyone knows that hemp makes a lot more CBD than marijuana. So we started looking in at the industrial application, but also the medical application, all for research. So they had partnered with the Malawian government, and they were doing some really pioneering developments with a research license in the Malawian government on extraction of CBD per se. And as a chemical engineer, I was extremely thrilled about this. And yeah, I got the experience of a lifetime, and I got the opportunity to really kind of explore my scientific, keenness, and really build interesting extraction systems, and really gain some early days research that was extremely beneficial to the rest of my career.
Awesome, perfect. I mean, I hear you completely on that side. I mean, for those who don't know, I'm a biochemist as well. So, like, you're a chemical engineer. I was tempted to go into engineering. I kind of had the opinion that, I kind of was a big fan of drug development from an early stage. I'd done some stuff on tuberculosis and malaria, anti-malarial drugs. So, also a great experience. You go into it with the ultimate vision of developing products that can be commercialized, without really knowing that, if you're talking about an FDA drug that gets approved, the amount of preclinical and clinical work it has to go through, it's crazy, but it's a fascinating industry. And I mean, I still work in regular pharmaceutical manufacturing workflows, and it's just great to see products come to market and to see what goes into the chemical side of it, and the engineering and the quality control. But from there, I mean, you mentioned the developments in the US, and I think that's obviously more related to what happened with the Farm Bill in 2018. From there, I'm sure you moved to other spaces. I know you were in Lesotho for some time. Maybe tell us about the experience you had in Lesotho. Was it pre or post the Farm Bills into implementation in the US?
It was a post. So what happened was, I was a chemical engineer, so focused entirely on building machines, and I had some unique research and some unique experience that no one really in South Africa kind of had back then. And Lesotho had obviously just come out with their medical cannabis legislation, and there was, Canada and the US coming with, venture capital money, listed money, looking for local resources that had the experience. So when you look at starting a business, you obviously want to work with as much local contractors as possible. So yeah, I was invited to Lesotho as one of the local contractors to really do process development, as I had kind of first-hand experience on CBD and hemp and cannabis as a plant that was already in research phase. So yeah, I was very fortunate enough to go to Lesotho, and there kind of things went, I went from a complete research kind of developing techniques, investigating what techniques could work in Africa, could work, out in the middle of nowhere, what logistic supply chains of chemicals you need to look at, what companies are supplying these chemicals. Not a lot of people realize that. You try bringing an American or Canadian into Africa and you tell them, hey, go order some pentane that's analytical reagent grade. They're like, so I think that's what really made me unique, in that I had already set up in my own head the logistic supply chains in Southern Africa that could support the industrialization and commercialization. So I transitioned from a research into a commercial kind of environment. And that really kind of gave me significant experience. There was capital, there was off-takes, there was product development. It was set up for a commercial export business. But surrounding that, that is when the words GMP came up. That is when good manufacturing practice really became a day-to-day of my life, basically working with pharmacists. So I went from working with research agronomists and research chemists into working with commercial pharmacists and commercial regulatory pharmacists. And that's where I had to take my research and kind of implement it into a commercial aspect, but also implement it in a way that supports good manufacturing practice. And that's where my kind of career as an engineer really unfolded, because I was getting fed all this information by top educated pharmacists and top educated consultants around GMP, and figuring out how does one take this research and really implement it into a GMP environment for commercial medical cannabis production. And yeah, I was very lucky to be at the start of some really big projects in Lesotho, building out GMP facilities, and also kind of doing more process development around isolation, remediation, formulation, distillation, extraction, various types of extraction. And as a chemical engineer, my mind was just blown. I was just being fed amazing amounts of information, of all these different solvents. And it was awesome to really firsthand see what works and how the industry is going to unfold from its early days in Lesotho. And that's what happened in Lesotho, was really the commercial aspect around it.
Awesome, perfect. I mean, and this is something I will say about Africa and South Africa and the region is often when you look at US companies or the European zone, even Australia, it's very rare to actually find people that are a jack of all trades. They get put into so many different functional roles within a pharmaceutical manufacturing value chain. And I almost see that as a massive benefit. I mean, technically, I also get to see a lot of pharmaceutical sites, facilities. They're my usual clients. We work on process optimization, from anything from injectables to oral solid dosage form tablets. And then we're working on botanical extractions and herbal products. And then you go to fast-moving consumer goods, and then you also focus on EU GMP specifications, and then you're working on analytical testing, and you're working on quality assurance. And that's just crazy. When you deal with individuals in the US or in Europe, they're like, how's it possible that you find so many diverse skill sets within a conversation? And it's usually specialists in those fields. And I think South Africans are so fortunate that it's not spoon-fed, or it's not as siloed or restrictive, because you almost need to understand the full value chain from seed to sale just to be able to commercialize effectively. And I mean, I like that story, like that ability to be, you're a chemical engineer, and then all of a sudden you're in regulatory compliance, and the whole works in between, and it's fascinating. And I mean, the GMP discussion is always a good one, because Lesotho, for instance, is not a member of PICS, which is the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, which makes it challenging, because you almost have to build a facility and hit a GMP standard that can be internationally inspected directly without having, for instance, a local medical regulator like SAPRA come in and do pre-inspections, approve. And even, there's a lot to be said about the differential between like a local GMP audit and an international, let's call it a B-Farm German audit. But it's one where it's kind of, if you look at it, it at least gets you a stepping stone in the right direction, because you're using PICS as a guidance for that GMP. So for me, I mean, before we go into too much of the geeking out on the facility side, I mean, I know one thing that's come up a lot, and I've seen it as well, is you collaborate well with universities as well. I mean, so it's kind of bridging that gap between the universities and the commercialization aspect. Maybe tell us a bit more about some of the experience you've had with local universities in the space, and what their focus is in terms of cannabis and its potential.
Yeah, this is an extremely important point, and when you look at a new industry, and particularly in Southern Africa or Africa, and we speak about topics such as job creation. Let me give you a quick example. When petrol was discovered and diesel was discovered and kerosene and all these things, they had to educate people to be able to build systems to manufacture those products to benefit society. That's job creation. And birth a chemical engineer, building distillation columns to really refine crude oil. So for me, it really starts at education. It starts at the universities, and it starts at developing a skill. So some of the university projects that we are looking at, going back to the environmental protection, for me as a chemical engineer, one of the most interesting things is, cannabis as an industry is developing, waste. It's developing raffinate, it's developing waxes, it's developing solvents, it's developing waste. And we need to, look at that waste's value. We need to really educate people and engineers to figure out solutions around using that waste and really creating value, and right there, you are creating a job, a potential career, and a potential industry. Another example is there's a byproduct from making petrol, and it is waxes. And those waxes are actually used as lubricants, on gears and motors. And there's a whole other industry, So a lot of the research and a lot of the university kind of impact that I'm trying to have is surrounding the areas that I feel uncomfortable with, starting from the technology approach, the waste approach, as well as then moving further down the line, which also interests me, is then the drug development approach. So I'm not specifically involved with drug development, but it's also important, when we look at South Africa, we have no registered products. There has been no clinical trials. There's been no formal phase 1 or phase 2 kind of clinical trials. We don't really have any research supporting that, the toxicology of this is safe. Humans, it's fit for human consumption, and we should be having registered products, So I think it's extremely important for the universities as well to also investigate this. They've investigated Skelete, which is extremely great for anti-anxiety and also stress, and it's been researched, and there's been drug development. So a lot of the universities that I work, so my favorite relationship right now is I'm working with Prof. Matsabisa. He's, for me, one of the most inspiring researchers in drug development. He, he's a jack of all trades. He loves engineering. I love talking engineering with him. He really understands the engineering approach. He is recognized for developing really unique indigenous botanical therapeutic medicines. And, he's really also at the forefront of this. And he's an innovator, and he's also a collaborator in the space. And and his whole role is, developing, I don't want to speak for him now, but, developing these drugs, for an African market and really putting Africa on the map. We have unique strains as well in South Africa that, have not been investigated. These landrace strains that have, unique ratios of cannabinoids, and he's really forefronting that. And someone needs to do it. Someone needs to say that this medicine is safe for human consumption and it can do A, B, or C. So working with those, and what I want to do as a collaborator is have the opportunity to standardize that. So from an engineering approach is to standardize his research. This research cannot be done unless there is a standardized supply and quality assured kind of supply, from the whole supply chain. And that's really how research is kind of done. So yeah, that's how collaborating.
Exactly. I mean, what do we call it? In the US, they call it an IND, an investigational new drug, that obviously leads to an NDA, a new drug application. And for anyone who doesn't know, I mean, there's good publications even by the USP and FDA on this for clinical researchers. You have to get stability of product as a first line requirement to be able to go into clinical, even preclinical on an animal model, looking at toxicology, like you said, pharmacodynamics and kinetics. As you go into human trials, that needs a stable, almost source of extracted products so that you can put in the work, put in the hours, set up the clinical trials. And I mean, this is also something that kind of gets me, warmed up in a sense with discussion with regulators, because I just think of the analytical side. I look at testing. You need a permit to bring in a cannabinoid-based standard. This is a bit of an area where I feel there needs to be a room for exemptions on analytical and supporting more analytical facilities and testing. It's nice to go for a GLP, a good laboratory practices standard, for a testing lab, and I understand the importance of that, as well as ISO 17025 around the qualification and the validation of the methods, establishing linearity, all of that in terms of the validation of the method. But we need to make it easy for researchers and for testing labs to get access to cannabis-based reference standards so that they can offer this as a service, firstly for consumers who are interested, so they can get a test and know it's a proper ISO SANAS type of accredited test. And also just for universities to be able to, supply testing results here. It can't be overly laborious and overly bogged down by legislation. I mean, if we're talking about reference standards, and I actually think of Prof. Kateri here as well. I had a discussion with him not so long ago from TUT at Tshwane University of Technology, and he had USP come in to that discussion. So shout out to a gentleman from USP who actually made time for South Africa, and we were talking about the different types of products. And one of the things I said to him was they need to bundle all the reference standards into a single product, so that you can actually do one permit application. Because we sit here with every single reference standard, you need a permit. And I was like, why? Do that as a start point, because it will help the industry. I'm kind of going off my own tangent here, but when it comes to universities, I mean, Prof. Matsabisa is awesome. I know I've told him he needs to come on here as well, so I'm hoping to have him come on. So if not, this is a hint to him. We will probably watch this as well, to have him on. But now moving on, I want to start talking a bit about, when we talk about, products, I think, let me put it this way. There's a dual cropping strategy. So dual cropping, where you're basically looking to, get the most out of grains, ancillary byproducts, raffinate. Maybe talk to me a little about how you see the international relationships between cultivators or growers and extractors and processors, because I do think some of that's missing here locally, where we almost need to now define with the cannabis or the National Cannabis Master Plan discussion tomorrow, what is the route forward for Department of Agriculture. How do we go into the space about how do we facilitate things like dual cropping, getting the most value out of the actual products and the actual plant without having all this unnecessary waste? Can you talk us through that and some of the experiences you've seen in the space?
Certainly, this is also a big thing that I've been lucky to experience. I've seen companies with, the hemp commercialization, the medical cannabis commercialization, and there needs to be a split, but there also needs to be an integration, because as a industry, there's always overlapping. So when we look at the dual cropping, we don't really need to reinvent the wheel here. It's extremely important that we only need to reinvent the wheel for things that are kind of country specific. But when it comes to legislation specific, let's take an example. Let's look at the registered industrial hemp farmer in Europe. And let's look at Austria, because Austria does, a great regulatory job here with industrial hemp. We've got certified, industrial hemp seeds, and there's been farmers there for, pre-CBD kind of novel food days. There's been farmers there farming for grain, they're farming for hemp foods. Everyone's seen the hemp smoothies, the hemp hearts and stuff like that. But, farmers and industry also move forward. There was all the CBD, and yes, Finola and Futura has got between 2 and 4% CBD. There's still value in that crop, so after you sort that seed and you get your crop, there's still a raffinate, which is a seed sorted kind of material, and it's impossible for that business to really extract that just because they're farmers, but they also want to be a part of this kind of movement with CBD and also incorporate their brand. So for me, in South Africa, the Cannabis Master Plan is talking about, commercializing hemp as an agricultural product. But how do we match the Department of Agriculture's laws with SAPA's laws? And as a pharmaceutical manufacturer here, when it comes down to processing this raffinate, within the process, you are going to have the concentration of THC, which is obviously a controlled substance globally. And there's regulation on CBD. So a perfect example, maybe not perfect, who knows, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it kind of works. Having your dew crop is quite simple. You have the farmer, he wants to grow for the seed, he produces the seed, and private sector and the farmer or the pharmaceutical manufacturer can work with the hemp farmer. We can work then also with government on the regulatory framework around this, and to say, look, guys, the farmer is going to produce this amount of seed. There's Futura and Finola, it's coming from a certified breeder. We know that, after maybe a bit of research, with some crops, that we're going to get so much raffinate after sorting the seeds. We can then take that research to the regulator and say, okay, guys, here's a specification sheet for the farmer. He's going to build up a little area, that's clean and sterile, and he's going to validate his packing and his specification of that packing suitable for an input raw material to us. Then it would be up to us to arrange the legitimate distribution of that with registered companies who can go and procure that or pick that up from the farmer, take it to our facility where we can go through the necessary extraction and then remediation and then legitimate incineration of those controlled substances according to regulatory framework, blended to a suitable complementary or to a suitable legal limit for the market, and that's also considered safe for the consumer, and then deliver back a finished good. That for me is integration. It's kind of economic stimulating, and it's also there for the consumer who's interested in these products, who's interested to incorporate CBD as a medicine or a complementary health product to their daily life. So you've got kind of a match and marry of agriculture and health. You don't have to have them completely separate. We can work together. We just got to do the research, take the research and develop the framework. So that for me does work, and it is shown to work. It just needs to be well understood and well kind of implemented.
Yeah. So, I mean, the well understood and the well implemented are the two pitfalls there. And I mean, look, that's ultimately why we're doing this. I mean, I also get the discussion often, which is why are you putting out these video snippets, and what are you trying to share with agriculture, and what are you trying to share with local government, and even with SAPRA at times. Like, we're trying to communicate what is commonplace in the US and Canada and other maturing markets. Like Australia has done wonders in the last 18 months in the space. And for me, this is why we're having these discussions, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel, like you said. We have certain expertise here. We know how to do this. I want to use that example of what you're referring to now in terms of that dual cropping process. The biggest pitfall and the biggest challenge is testing. And I know we were looking to maybe discuss testing a bit at the end of our discussion, but I'm going to bring it in right here, because at the end of the day, if you can get a handle on the testing, and there is that, you mentioned the clean packing environment from the agricultural standpoint, the distribution to the actual processor. I mean, before that product gets released from quality, raw material holding, you've got to do certain tests. And I mean, the big ones are heavy metals. South Africa's got a mining history. We've got a lot of metals to consider in the soil. So when we talk about an agricultural approach, we need to be cognizant first and foremost of heavy metals. The next one is pesticides. I've been quite adamant and quite prolific in this discussion. I've said this many times and I'll continue to say it. SAPRA or anyone else responsible for this needs to put out a local pesticide testing list that we can use as a white paper, a reference, because there's no point in testing a Canadian, or Oregon, a California list, and we've got a completely different profile of local pesticides. So those are the two big things, is pesticides and heavy metals. Then we talk about, if we're talking solvents, there's that solvent extraction, but it's not important right now for quality of raw material. We also need to look at microbes, aflatoxins that can be produced from any fungus. So, I mean, there is that kind of array of tests outside of your potency and the rest of it. So, I mean, that should be the job, in my opinion, of the extractor. And when we talk about the extractor in that space, we're really talking about someone that should probably have oversight in terms of SAPRA. The medical regulators saying, okay, the processes we need to control, because if we understand who's doing the processing, the extraction, and we control that point, we really are taking a critical step in quality assurance and quality control. And, if the farmer, yes, there could be hot hemp, and we're going to talk about remediation after this, but, ultimately there is a separate way to go about, ensuring that they're growing from certified seeds, ensuring that there are spot checks on, the type of hemp that's been running those fields. And I don't want to talk too much about outdoor hemp versus maybe medical GSP, GMP type of cannabis, but in terms of the testing, tell me some of your experiences around testing. We've talked about the lack of reference standards, the lack of qualified labs in the space that can really be under the supervision of SAPRA and, SANAS, ISO standard. What have you seen in terms of testing, some of your experiences? I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so look, testing is probably the most important part of all of this. If we don't have serious testing capabilities, we're not taking ourselves as an industry very seriously here. The most important thing, firstly, is the consumer. We need to really protect the consumer. That's SAPRA's mandate, is to protect the safety and the health of the consumer. Second, we need to be, as a business, we need to, regulate kind of the industry in a professional manner. We need to set the standards, and we need to adhere to those standards. If we are to build a successful industry, we need to really set those standards and really adhere to them. So testing is an important aspect of this, mostly on you mentioned hot hemp. Now, as a consumer, testing these products to make sure there's not enough THC in there is really important to the consumer. They don't want to be going to the store and purchasing a product where there's not enough THC. But, in South Africa, we unfortunately have a lack thereof, validated, SANAS approved, or, ISO accredited, or even GLP stamped kind of testing, And I have a bit of experience with HPLC myself, running the HPLC at our facility as well. And it's unfortunate, but it's actually not as simple as taking a plant or an extract or product and just injecting it into the machine, and out comes the printer and there's the results. It's actually not that simple. It's actually
I'm gonna jump in there as well, just for everyone who doesn't know. HPLC is high performance or high pressure liquid chromatography. To give everyone context as well, I mean, Separations as a company, we started out 32 years ago in things like HPLC, selling Phenomenix, a lot of those columns that go into the HPLCs. It's an extremely, the guys just assume when you talk to commercial interests, they're just like, yeah, we'll buy some analytical equipment, we'll just pop it in the lab, they'll just do it. It's typically, you need an analytical chemist usually, because usually in HPLC you got to do sample prep, right? And you got to do proper dilutions. You got to validate those methods. You got to make sure that you're doing it the same way every time, setting up a proper SOP, validating your SOP with reference standards. And you got to make sure that those reference standards are not ancient, their stability has gone off shelf, because now if you're comparing yourself against a poor reference standard, you're going to get a terrible result. You're going to think it's right. You're going to send it off to an international customer. They're going to test it with an accredited ISO type of GLP lab, and they're going to get a different answer, and they're going to trust the lab that's fully accredited in their jurisdiction, and they're going to say, listen, you can take your product and stick it, because at the end of the day, I'm going to follow like a Eurofin standard, guys that are established in that testing space. I'm not necessarily going to just believe your results. And, it produces a spectrum. You got to look at that. You got to look at the peaks. You got to know what's in the peak, what's not in the peak, what could be kind of blending the peaks. There's a lot to it. So I just wanted to unpack for the audience, when we talk about analytics, and it's really important, especially when you talk about a controlled GMP process design, you need to have critical control points throughout your manufacturing with the intention of demonstrating quality control. So that you basically have these PAT or process analytical tools that based on your, quality design of your extraction, your workflow, you can validate the steps as you go along so you can pick up a problem early. So I support your statement there about, running an HPLC. It's just not like switching on a printer. There's a
Yeah,
process to it. So continue with that
exactly.
and maybe tell us a bit more about the lab experience.
Yeah, so I mean, what would be really great now is, if there could be some sort of reference in South Africa, to say, hey guys, once a month, I'm going to take this product, or all the labs that are registered with SAPRA, there should be a mandate or a kind of assistance there to say, guys, everyone send the same product around, and let's all make sure that our methods are correctly validated. Let's all make sure that the standard is there, and let's all make sure that we are following the correct methods, because there could be a lab that could have their own methods, and they might get a result and be like, oh, this is pretty good, but they might change the matrix of that sample from a flower to a finished good, and might just claim the same results. That's not how it's done. Sample prep is extremely important. If you just go too far with your thumb on that pipette, the error is extremely enormous. So I think having a reference kind of lab setup to help regulate laboratories here is going to give firstly, the most important comfort of the consumer, knowing, okay, this has a stamp that has been, certified by this laboratory, or it's been approved by SAPRA's, third-party laboratory testing, who knows. Second, it's going to give private sector the comfort, knowing that their revenues based on these laboratory testing are correct.
Yeah.
Guys could be sending, they could ruin their reputation internationally. They could send a batch of flowers to Europe, as it gets there, boom, fails micro. We all know what that could happen is, it gets sent back. There's insurances in place. It's an extremely difficult liability to deal with as private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned micro there, just for the audience. Micro obviously refers to microbiological testing. We used to, so basically, if for anyone who's not familiar, there's usually like a monograph for a drug, or even something like a floss or inflorescence or flower product. Your bud from the cannabis. And I've done this on the channel as well, where I talk a bit about, I use the Dutch monograph as an example. There's a German one as well. I use Bedrocan, which is the licensed producer for the Office of Medical Cannabis. And there we went through a COA, or Certificate of Analysis, that looked at following a guidance on the monograph. And what it includes is things like fineness, potency, aflatoxins, pesticides, heavy metals, you name it. But the other thing that's important is your microorganisms. Because at the end of the day, if you're not testing your microbes for, yeast, anaerobics, you name it, and you're not actually incubating that and growing up the cultures and seeing what's in your, if there's any contamination, because it's a non-sterile product often that we're talking about and not a sterile product. So there's a difference there in stringency, and I won't go into it. But just know that your micro and your microorganisms can be a real threat to your product quality, because ultimately when you package it, if you've not, I'll use an example. Guys are just packing and not even removing oxygen, like doing a nitrogen or argon purge on their packed products. And if you send that off and it sits in customs and it sits in holding, microorganisms can grow. And as they grow, you get spoilage, which is known in the food industry quite well. But spoilage is a massive concern on a pharmaceutical type of product. And that definitely is going to throw your product straight out the door. It's going to be return to sender or immediate destruction of your product when it arrives. And I fully support that need for increased analytical, which is your type of analytical tests, which is HPLC, mass spectrometers, GCs, and the rest. And then there's ICP as well for the metals. And then there's the micro side, which needs to be seen more, there needs to be more of it. And I'm a big fan here. And I think let's switch topics, because we were kind of like sticking into the analyticals. But I want to talk about remediation, because you mentioned remediation. So if I'm doing analytical testing and I'm seeing that I've got a spike in THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, how do I go about remediating that product so it comes into a legal norm? So if we talk about a legal norm, let's maybe use a 0.3% cutoff. Let's talk strategies here, because I'm quite passionate about THC remediation, and I know you are as well. Let's talk about it commercially. If I'm now producing a CBD product, similar to what's on the slide deck here below. If I were to do a full finish on a product that's going into let's call it a broad spectrum CBD product, and we are allowed to go to a certain limit. I'm not going to get into the register or the actual limits at the moment. But if I've got 2% or 3% THC, how do I go about remediation, and what is that process?
Yeah, so just to give the listeners a bit of background of remediation, it's basically we need to remove the contaminants that is seen as THC from the product to the specification. So let's go actually back to analytics. So let's go back to the HPLC. So in the HPLC, we have chromatography. And typically what's used, to go from a 2 to 3% to a 0.3%, there's the more kind of scientific approach and technology-based approach, which is, flash chromatography. So that means taking your extract, put it into a solvent-based kind of mobile phase and running it through a column based on a pre-investigated method that works, that gives you scalability and commerciality of that. So basically, you want to run as much product through a column. So basically what happens is you take, we know when CBD, THC, and the other ones elute, which back to the listeners to give you a bit more background is when you take your distillate that has maybe got too much THC, you would basically dilute it in a mobile phase, and you would run it through a packed column of, let's call it silica or even sand. Now based on the molecule size, which is CBD and THC, those molecules are going to separate, okay? And some of the CBD is going to come out last and the THC is going to come out first. So we can develop these methods on an HPLC and directly scale that method to a flash chromatography system, which means you're literally just flashing that diluted extract in a mobile phase solvent to a suitable level, and then re-evaporating that solvent and then having the THC completely separated. So that's one aspect that you could, let's say, remediate. Another method that guys did or businesses did in US was literally just opening that CO2 valve with the extract directly into massive drums of MCT, or massive kind of reactors of MCT, then you kind of just blending it down and kind of cutting it down based on a predetermined formula that you already know. Another kind of remediation would be, crystallizing or, doing some sort of liquid extraction with the crystallization of CBD and then, removing that THC in a mother liquor, which then can be destroyed. So there's various forms, but I'd say the most kind of, commercially available, it's just unfortunate that it is an extremely expensive process because you're using solvents that are, quite expensive. You're usually also trying to use analytical grade or HPLC grade, and then also the recovery of that. So there's a consumable cost on solvents, but there's also a consumable cost on heating and cooling. So it does become an extremely expensive process, and that's why I think some companies opted to rather just blend or remediate by just opening the valve directly into MCT.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the thing. We're not looking to scare anyone out from the industry on this. It's an aspect to consider. At the end of the day, there's a lot of companies that are doing some form of remediation. Even pesticide remediation has been done prolifically in the US, where if you have pesticides, it's not necessarily the end of the world. You can remediate from that. So for anyone who didn't know, remediation can be applied to a lot, even potentially on metals, but it's more challenging. So I'm going to warn you there as well. I mean, I know it as well. Like you said, chromatography, different methods. There's even aptamers, the use of molecular imprinting. It's very basically what you're doing is you're manipulating the rate of association of a biomolecule of interest, so CBD or THC, to a stationary column where, it kind of like, almost think of it like a magnet. It sticks more to this one and then it slowly gets banded. So you separate bands and your THC or your CBD comes out first, depending on your choice of resin, and you basically can partition. And then through that expensive method, it's an option. The other options, like I said, a liquid extraction, crystallization, manipulating the biphasic properties of, a solvent, pulls a certain product in or out. And then I've seen things like harmonic distillation, which is usually coupled to a HPLC, where you're basically doing some kind of degradation of THC directly. My only big concern is when you do things like that, and I've seen this being pushed in mainstream, in the US and Canada, you've got to be bringing a mass spec into that. Because, I mean, we're talking now about the same thing as with the Delta 8 conversions on THC, which is a big thing within the US and the US Department of Agriculture. But we're talking about cyclic conversions. And if you're talking about conversion-based chemistry, you're going to have byproducts. And this is nowhere where the industry is ready. South Africa's not ready for what we're talking about yet. But it will be the mainstream developing discussion as we go to a maturing industry. And, I think it's one where, it's good to see what is happening. In a sense, the US and Canada is optimizing all of this for eventual industrial scale rollout in Africa. But I think there's a lot there. I mean, it's a fascinating space. I'm sure you agree with me on that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to give you a bit of research. During my research days, when I made Delta 8, I was like, wow, this is ridiculously easy, but also ridiculously scary.
Yeah.
One part of that is because when you do these cyclic conversions, moving these double bonds in these molecules and literally creating molecules, so creating synthetics, whether it's even CBN or Delta 8, you are using harmful substances, using acids, using metals, and if you aren't fully equipped to do heavy metal remediation, how is the consumer going to be safe? So these things are really easy, and the consumers need to know that these things are extremely easy. But the post-processing and the downstream kind of quality control and quality assurance of the final release of these products to the consumer, there we need to have extreme caution, and we need to have eyes on there and watch it very closely, because we've seen Delta 8 gummies coming around, and basically to the listeners, Delta 8 is when you take it's we've seen the CBD price kind of really kind of go down a bit and kind of wobble down on the low end of where it used to be. And so, science is always innovating, and, capitalism is always innovating. And when you take capitalism and science together, you can get some potentially harmful things for the consumer, more so around Delta 8. And what it means is you can take CBD, you can either dunk it in a bath of acid or mix it with a couple of, metals to reduce that pH. And all you're going to do is have a bit of a bond switch where instead of Delta 9, you're going to have Delta 8. So you can take a completely non-psychoactive molecule and make a psychoactive, molecule with just a bit of chemistry. But the implications are, as I mentioned, the remediation of those harmful substances afterwards, if those aren't properly adhered to, and who's testing. As we innovate, there needs to be more testing. No one's testing for those methods. No one's testing for those acids. You haven't seen a certificate of analysis that has actually introduced that. So Delta 8 could probably pass, a COA that has been used for Delta 9, because those new chemicals that are being used have never really been considered as a threat to the consumer.
Yeah.
So this is where you get kind of the catch up, all the time as the industry innovates.
Yeah. And I mean, this is why industry and regulators need to work together. I mean, the biggest thing here is, you could take CBD and convert it to Delta 9. I mean, that's completely doable as well. So we talk about a Schedule 0 CBD product and, that's fine. But if you're a chemist and you know what you're doing, we're talking about conversions that can be done to Delta 9 as well. So regulators need to listen to industry, because, that's a realistic concern in any regulated market, but it doesn't stop Canada and the US from working with industry and looking at how to enforce best quality assessments and practices to ultimately get a quality product, whether that's a pharmaceutical product or a dietary supplement product or something like a complementary medicine. Those are the kind of things I think that it's really important that these discussions facilitated, because for those who didn't know, oh wow, I didn't even know you could do that. Well, now you do, and there are ways about it, but we've got to put measures and stop checks in place on how do we ultimately, people are going to do what they want to do. I've seen, if you look at how the cartels have operated in Colombia, the types of chemicals, you talked earlier about distribution of chemicals. There are certain chemicals that are critical to the manufacture of, cocaine that is not regulated. And you can't regulate it easily. So, it's one of those things where, people will be entrepreneurial. People come up with a plan, and usually in South Africa they do. But I think it's really important that industry and regulators talk more frequently, implement systems, do self-checks, the rest. I wanted to jump into a topic that is quite interesting as well. I mean, we talked about, there doesn't seem to be, in South Africa, cosmetics is a big space for, products that we could see. So especially when you're talking about preserving the lipids, the waxes from the plant, as well as the infusion into topicals. I haven't seen too much legislative guidance in the space here. It's been one we've been asking for a while. And if we combine that with the discussion on novel foods in the UK, tell us a bit more about your views on cosmetics and novel foods, and where do we see the industry going in other regions, and what can we anticipate here locally, provided that legislation follows in beat with that?
Yeah, so I think, to quickly touch on the cosmetic stuff, in South Africa, we haven't really seen much regulation around topical applications of cannabinoid-based or cannabis or cannabis-derived. I spoke earlier about some of the waste. So we know that, through the cannabis process, and you remove waxes and lipids, and those can easily be, emulsified into a great kind of, topical, that hasn't really been investigated, but in South Africa per se, but there's no regulation around that. So there's also no regulation, or there's no really guidance on the use of CBD as topicals. And if you look at the Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is the TGA, which kind of does the whole guidelines for Australia, they're actually strict on CBD topicals. We look at skin differently. Well, we need to understand skin is a big organ. If we are going to be absorbing cannabinoids and medicines through our skin, it's an extremely important place to just have a look at. So I think it would be quite nice to see a little bit more regulation around kind of cosmetics in South Africa. And then when we look at the novel foods, the novel foods is there again to protect the consumer. And crazy, but when you look at chia, I've been using chia for many years now as a source of, a superfood. But chia was on the novel food list. The Aztecs, used it as an abundance of energy, but Europeans had never really used chia, until the recent couple of decades. So immediately people started putting it in smoothies and everything. But was it safe, And it only recently came off, which has allowed the industry to really boom. So novel food is basically when we look at hemp as a food. It's been used as food, and there's been very trace amounts of CBD in the pressed kind of oil. I think SAPRA puts a number of about 0.0075% CBD in a cold pressed hemp seed oil. Now we're taking a hemp seed oil and we're, somewhat fortifying it in Europe with, concentrated CBD isolate. That's new to the liver, that's new to the kidney, that's new to the body. Could it have implications? Potentially. So let's put it on the novel food list, and let's do toxicology, bioavailability, kind of preclinical trial kind of investigations around that. I think what the UK has done is they've said to brands, look, your product you need to apply for your product as a novel food, which means your manufacturing process firstly has to have quality assurance, but then you also have to provide stability of your active ingredients, which is a big thing that we need in this industry.
Yeah.
You need to provide toxicology reports, which is an extremely important part, which is, investigations which, Prof. Matsabisa is looking at. So all of these things really do play together, and it's interesting to see globally the different strategies, of this. So yeah, it's an interesting space to watch the UK now, because I'm very curious to see what brands are really doing it, how are they going to monitor it, the application process. It's an extremely good place to watch. I know that they've extended it ever so slightly now, and I think they have until the 31st of March. So deadlines for brands for novel food applications actually ends 31 March. So it'll be interesting to see how the regulate forms after that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is the thing. It's super fascinating. A lot's going to happen in the space. The one thing I'd like to bring us to is, I actually want to, if you got a minute, just, I've got pictures of your facility On the deck here as well, some of the equipment that I recognize as well. But, so talk us through, your experience in botanicals. What are some of the lessons you've learned? Maybe I'm going to go back a slide quickly, getting familiar with the whole GMP aspect of things. Talk us through botanicals as a broader spectrum of products. Like you're involved in a few different botanicals that are commonplace, and you export those botanicals as well. Talk us through that a bit, and then you can just give us some guidance points, and then I think we'll be coming up in the hour, which means we'll start wrapping up. But I know we're going to have probably another discussion very soon. I mean, we can go to any of these verticals quite deep. I mean, we could probably talk about remediation and cyclic chemistry for an hour to itself. So I think let's maybe talk a bit. I'm going to move the thumbnail here on my side for anyone watching as well. Some of that equipment, the facility, maybe if you can talk us through that, so that, the audience has a better context for what you've been up to.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at the bottom, right, and that was when we kind of had the facilities. So that's an explosion-proof room. So when you work with botanicals, you need to have your choice of solvent. This is a big topic I get asked every single day: CO2 or ethanol. Both have their place, and I get asked this on a daily basis. It's really crazy. But when it comes down to us, we chose ethanol. Because we chose ethanol is because ethanol is great for all botanicals, or ethanol and water. So that's why we didn't really go the CO2 route, and because we were focused more on that. So you need to understand your molecules. You need to understand the polarity of them. You need to understand what they are going to be blended in. Is it a capsule? Is it a carrier oil? Is it a liquid formulation? Is it a topical? So once you understand your molecule, you then need to look at the solvent. Are you going to be doing an aqueous ethanol extraction? Are you going to be doing a pure ethanol extraction? Once you then have the molecule and the solvent, then you really can open up the can of worms, which is design. You need to then take into safety aspects. When you're using 1,000 liters of ethanol in 4 hours, how do you know and how do you prevent explosions on mass scales? How do you make sure that when the insurance company comes and does their inspection on your facility, that you have got it correctly classed? That means your flooring, underneath that flooring, it's not just vinyl flooring. There's actually a complete anti-static flooring solution over there. The airflows, obviously our facilities are positive pressure, class 6 air. But the flow of the air, are you going to have recycle of air when you're handling 1,000 liters of ethanol? Is your system going to be completely closed? And this really starts then going back to GMP. You need to understand your product, you need to understand your solvents, and then you need to understand what a URS means, which is called the user requirement specification. And then you can start on your journey. But if you don't know what a URS means, what your molecule is, where you're going, and how you're going to extract it, then you should definitely not be taking the next steps. And there should be extreme caution on that, because if you just don't think about those aspects, it's going to open up a can of worms. So that's just a part of the design. You need to make sure that your employees are safe, your consumers are safe, your business is optimized, and that you fall in line with the guidelines.
Perfect. I'm going to jump in there, Peter, quickly, because I want to mention something on what you said there. So, good point on the URS. I very often don't see one coming from customers. At the end of the day, there's good technical teams out there. The point of people in this industry is to support and develop these processes. I mean, you mentioned supercritical and ethanol. The one thing we didn't mention is hydrocarbons. And this goes back to some of the regulatory concerns you're talking about an anti-static floor design. When we're talking about hydrocarbons, we're talking about explosion-proof light fittings, firewall retardant, there it goes on. But, these are the things that guys don't think about is they look at the equipment and they'll say, okay, well, these large industrial ethanol extraction centrifuges, they're interesting. The supercritical, super expensive up front. I'm not so sure. I'm just going to blast with some columns. And you can do that, but you can also blast yourself with some columns. And this is the thing that we're going to see in the industry is, what is considered a hobbyist or even a small scale extraction platform is you've got to start looking at things like C1, D1, class 1, division 1 for butane and hydrocarbons and propane. You've got to look at C1, D2 requirements around ethanol, the antistatic flaws, and the rest of that. I mean, supercritical is interesting from the perspective of your terpene preservation, and also from the perspective of like the long-term cost of CO2 makes it attractive long-term. But at the same time, if you're producing mass distillate, ethanol, which we've discussed in the past, is a really sweet kind of optimal solution for high quality distillate production. So I mean, I want us to talk maybe a little about some of the other images here, but I mean, for me, exactly that. It's not as simple as, oh yeah, we're just going to stick it in a room and see what happens. I mean, if there's no QBD, quality by design approach to the facility and the safety aspects and your staff, like you said, you're basically setting yourself up for long-term failure. And you know what? There are people in this industry that understand some of the risks and how to mitigate that. And I mean, some of them have been on this channel talking, and it's so great to have you on as well, because there's so much that industry can be supported by. And just us talking about it supports the industry, because it kind of just makes them aware and cognizant of like, oh, wait, I got to actually sit down and go to a QBD, quality by design approach, so I can mitigate long-term risk, I can ensure safety, and I can make sure that my business can be operational in 20 years, 10 years from now, and not just in 2 years. Cool.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
No, it's extremely important. I mean, how are you going to get water to your facility? You're just going to stick a tap in the rim? Not as simple, not as simple, So it's really, you need to understand the product. You mentioned distillate, that's a product. How does the business get there? That's the journey you need to unfold. Yeah, so the second picture over there is just a distillation. So it's a basic wide film distillation column. So basically over there, we're able to really refine and selectively distill compounds based on boiling point. And that's a little bit. Another bit of our facilities, we have a centrifuge. So we've kind of incorporated room temperature to extremely cold, so let's call it a cryogenic sub-negative 40 degrees Celsius ethanol extraction from like a batch to batch. So the centrifuge approach has been seen widely in the US. There's a company called Delta Separations. They're making great equipment. But when you have to go back to this URS thing, you need to look at the regulatory framework. Are you being governed by the foods guidelines, where NSF is going to give you a GMP stamp, or are you being regulated by the pharma guidelines, where SAPA is going to give you a GMP stamp? Both require different types of materials of steel. Both require different types of product contact parts. It's really not that simple. So from quality by design, that's one of these aspects. So the pass-through hatch where you see me there looking at some quality control, some pelargonium. Simple aspects by, cross-contamination of people, from different areas needs to be considered. You need to minimize cross-contamination of products. In the second photo over there, you can see through the window a beautiful three-way skid that James and I designed that we are extremely proud of, and we had lots of fun designing that. But, that system over there does three things. It can evaporate and recover solvents. It can react, so it can actually decarboxylate or remove the final residuals, and it can also crystallize or do liquid extraction. So that's a three-way skid. And how we actually achieve all of that, once again, when I mention water, is we actually have a clean in place. So that's actually regarded all as one skid. And by clean in place means that there's a PLC which you push clean, you throw in a clean detergent, and the whole system flushes itself. And you have to validate that process, from product to product, from batch to batch, from lot to lot. Then the most important part of this entire discussion is far bottom right, which we haven't really discussed in detail a lot, but that's stability, accelerated stability. Consumers don't really think about, where's this expiry date come from? We just see expiry dates and they're, did we just take this meat and put it out there and just wait till it stinks? No, we actually took that product, put it into a chamber where you can control humidity and temperature. And you can actually then use your HPLC, which is the photo above there, and actually map at what temperatures and storage conditions that product deactivates, and how sensitive these products are. So this is extremely important for registering products. And when you do dossier submissions, when you want to actually register and bring to market a product that is going to have hardcore claims, like take this and your back pain's gone. When you're looking at the active ingredients of that, you need to understand that if that product, through the supply chain from here to anywhere, even the discount store, you need to make sure that product does not go outside those kind of stability areas. And that's why it's extremely important, we believe, to have in-house stability and ongoing stability. So that means taking retention samples of each batch and holding them there for, between 12 months to 36 months. So yeah, that's a bit about that, is having stability. And I haven't actually seen a cultivator that I've witnessed in South Africa that actually has a stability chamber on site. And for me, that doesn't make sense, because when you look at the monographs and when you look at the European models and you look at all these things, Peter-William, as you mentioned earlier, they've got all the stability data. They've got all of this on site, and the cultivators also don't have HPLC, on site. So, they do a lot of their genetic selection and pheno hunting and that with non-HPLC approaches, which I understand from a commercial and business and minimizing operational expenses, but from producing an API, these are concepts you really have to get and really have to implement. You can outsource them to laboratories that are approved to do this, but it is good for in-process control and in-house quality assurance and quality control to make sure that before you even go to that independent lab, you are sure of yourself. So that's just 100%. A bit about what we.
Yeah, I fully agree on the point of stability. I mean, I've been kind of pushing this very hard. It's been a discussion, the importance for testing cabinets here. Like you mentioned it on the button there. I mean, there are basically different climatic zones as well, depending where your product's going. And like you said, it informs the shelf life claim and specification. So you need that stability data. And it also, I find, whenever you talk to someone in the, let's call it an off-take market, that kind of the next question outside of your standard testing is, do you have stability data for that cultivation facility? Do you have stability data for the extracts, the isolates? Because it tells us that the company has a QMA or a quality assurance type of mindset, because they're thinking about things like stability, and they're bringing that and incorporating that into their dossiers, their CTDs, their common technical documents, getting it all ready for what would be like maybe not a DMF, a drug master file, or more like an API master file, depending on where you are in the value chain. But it's super important when we're talking about, this is the big thing. Whenever you're dealing with SAPRA and you're dealing with cultivation, I know agriculture doesn't like to hear this, but if we're talking about medical products, we're talking about a pharmaceutical facility, which means the teams need to, if they don't have pharmaceutical regulatory compliance on board in the internal team, you've got to deal with guys in the space that understand the risk mitigation when it comes to a pharmaceutical facility, because you've got to make sure you are cognizant of it, because if you haven't been doing stability, you could have started 2 years ago. If you depending when you got your cultivation license, a year ago maybe or more, you could have started. You could have had stability data on flower that could have been available. And I mean, this is something I know we sell stability cabinets, we sell extraction equipment.
I bought one from you.
I know. So thanks for that, Peter. I mean, this is important. Like, if you're not testing it, and I know it sounds like a punt, but it's about risk mitigation. Like, at the end of the day, it's not, get it from anyone, but just make sure you qualified and you actually are doing these type of things to demonstrate quality, because you have to demonstrate quality when you're in pharma. So it's massively important. Peter, I've got to say once again, I know we're going to talk probably more in future episodes, but for me, this has been amazing to have this level of conversation. I think it's sorely lacking in South Africa, in Africa as a whole. I know that the rest of the African continent that comes online in the space is going to be looking probably to South Africa and Lesotho as hubs or for intellectual property or technical know-how on how to facilitate these type of businesses. So for me, I can only say a massive thank you for making the time. I know that we take our evenings to push this industry with passion, and very often I get this comment from industry, which is like, why are you sharing this information? And I mean, it's awesome to see such young and individuals driving the industry and putting it out there into the common domain because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, which is to formalize the health benefits of botanicals. And it's not going to happen in silos. We've got to talk about it. We've got to showcase it. And thank you for showcasing some of your facility, IP, intellectual property. I know there's a lot more, in the corners and, not available to be seen, and rightly so. But, you've done the industry a massive service by coming on and talking about it. And I would just encourage more individuals and organizations to do the same. And I'm looking forward to the engagements, and I'm looking forward to the future success of GES Labs. And I know that your team is very well constructed. So a shout out to James, Gustav, Hugo, everyone else in the team that's on here as well. They're not on tonight, but at the end of the day, Alan as well there. There's a bunch of people that are doing great work, not all youngsters. So shout out to Alan. But it's where we're gonna see amazing things happening in the space, and I'm super excited to see it. I'm super excited to see that we've got years, hopefully, still on the clock to drive this industry and to put South African botanical products on an international standard. And I've just got to say thank you once again. Any closing comments from your side in terms of advice to the industry before we shut out for today?
Yeah, no, I just want to first say, thank you, Jeff, for really, I think we've been chatting now since the beginning of our journey, specifically at GS. Yeah, and just thank you for what you've also been doing. It doesn't, you're not just making these videos just for fun. You are extremely passionate. You want to make sure that the right communication goes out there. So anyone listening to this, really, really, really spend the time to speak to Jeff. He really understands the industry globally. He understands US, he understands Europe, he understands South Africa, and he really understands the technology applications around us and what a business is going to bump their heads into when it comes down to manufacturing and testing. So guys, I really urge you, give Jeff a call, send him an email, his number's there. And just thank you for also having me. Really, I want to also send out, good information. I want to be real with what we need to do as an industry and how we can also innovate as an industry. But a last closing chapter that I would like to say for anyone listening to this is, understand where you want to be before you start. Do a reverse engineering. Understand what your end goal is. Feel comfortable with that. Is that what I want to do? Do I want to make a finished good? Do I want to make an oral? Do I want to make a cream? Do I want to send my product to Germany? Do I want to send it to Australia? Once you feel comfortable and you can sleep with that thought, work backwards to the beginning and start.
100%. Peter, thank you so much. I mean, that's the advice. I know that, look, this is always the risk. Whenever you're in a new business, a new entrepreneurial space, you won't always have all the right answers. But, the fact is, the industry, I'm always careful the word expert because, I feel an expert is someone who's always evolving and developing their knowledge base. But, there are industry individuals and professionals out there that understand it. I mean, you've walked a long journey for 6 years. Even though it's in a short space, I think you've iterated so rapidly. You've learned so much. You've picked up so many skill sets in the space that, 6 years experience in the space can easily be multiplied by a factor. And same for myself. I mean, I was in a completely different kind of space with aseptics and orals, more traditional products, plasma products, injectables. It's one where you've got to learn as you go and have a massive passion for it. And, collectively, this industry will happen. There's no refuting that. It's just about how do we put the measures in place now that formalize the industry in the right way so that when it does hit scale, that it's actually a global player that has got the best of the experience from across the world. And I think you're doing a massive service in the space. So I've included Peter's contact details. Please reach out to him on an email. I know you're actively engaged with a lot of the people. I'll disseminate this content too as well. But guys, I hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed doing it. I know we'll probably do more. And I just got to say a big thank you to Peter and his team for just spearheading and driving the space. And, hopefully we'll see industry realize what we can see on the horizon. And hopefully in 2021 or 2022, tomorrow is the National Cannabis Business Plan discussion. I'll be on that as well. Hopefully we will be able to influence industry appropriately and influence it for the better, so that we can all kind of create jobs. At the end of the day, that's what the economy is there for, commercializing businesses, that are focused on things like natural botanicals is a great place for South Africa to be. It's a passion that we share, and there's so much great products, plants, flora, fauna in the country that we just need to drive the development in this space. So I'm going to wrap it there. And Peter, a big thank you. I look forward to sharing this with everyone. And thank you again for having you on.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Cool. And everyone, thanks again for watching. That's us signing out. Have a good and safe time till the next episode.